My dear students, as we are discussing about competency-based interviewing, first of all, we need to discuss the purpose of the interview. Students, there are different types of the interview can be used at the different stages of the recruitment for the different purposes. So there are different types of interview, there are different stages of recruitment and selection processes, and there are different purpose of those interviews. So we have to discuss that what are different kind of purposes at the different stages of recruitment and selection process. There are three purposes that interviews can serve in the recruitment and selection process. The first purpose is initial screening. Sometimes we use interviews just for the initial screening, particularly when we have a large number of candidates appearing in the company for any particular position. Then the most common way of using interview is further screening or in-depth assessment. Whenever we want to do the in-depth interview assessment of the candidates, we can use in-depth screening process, and there we use interview. And number three, sometimes we just use interview as an information giving tool, or the tool which we can use to develop our personal relationship with the candidates. So these are the three major purposes which can be served for the interviewing in the recruitment and selection process. And obviously it means the employment interviewing. Some firms can use interview as initial screening of the candidates. When there is a large volume of candidates, obviously when you have hundreds of candidates, and it is not a good idea to interview in depth each and every candidate, so you can use the just initial screening interview. And this may be done over the phone, over the telephone. Nowadays, most of the companies are trying to do initial screening on telephone because it would save the cost of the interviewee, it would save the cost of the interviewer and the company, it would save the time of both interviewee and the interviewer. So it is very much comfortable for the interviewee to conduct the initial screening interview just on a telephone. One of the survey confirms that the telephonic screening is most likely to be used by large volume recruiter. It is, however, on the increase 35% of the current users have introduced it in the past 2 years. Means most of the time this kind of techniques are developing more in the past 2 years, and they are using telephonic screening. University campus interviews are an example where further screening might be done using an interview. At this stage, there are fewer candidates, and you can use initial screening have been accomplished previously by the telephonic interview or the application form, and in this stage, you would go for more in-depth interviews. Such interviews usually takes about 45 minutes and allow information to be collected on a small number of competencies. So this interview is very focused. This is in-depth assessment, where you are minutely looking at a different kind of competencies. So it is sort of a micro-analysis that you are analyzing the competencies of your candidates in more in-depth way. So this interview would last more times, and it in contrast to the initial screening interview, which may last only for 5 to 10 minutes, and it would be on telephone. Perhaps those identified through research as most critical are as the most difficult to develop further. So what kind of competencies are those? Those competencies which are fewer and which would take more time to develop, which are more difficult to be developed in the candidates. So such kind of competencies would be talked more in such kind of interviews. Then there is another purpose of the interview, or the information giving. Information giving is most likely to occur at second interview or at an assessment center. It may seem too odd to be talking about interview as an information giving. Yes, it looks very odd that you are just information giving through interview. However, there are some radical ideas that the interview should be removed from the front line of selection. So there are such kind of ideas that we should use interview only for the in-depth assessment, and we should not use interviews as the front lines of selection. Where suspect reliability and validity make it more menace, and use instead as a medium for negotiation with those with whom the organization wishes to discuss future employment. So interviews are also be used as a negotiating skills or as a negotiating time. So some of the companies use it as a negotiating tool. In this kind of interview, the power distance between the interviewer and the candidate should be equal, or anything in the favor of the candidate for the first time. So there should be an equal power distance between interviewer and the interviewee. The candidate must decide that whether they want to work for the organization or not want to work for the organization. And this is an opportunity to discuss the psychological contracts explicitly. So, dear students, there are psychological contracts between interviewee and the interviewer, and such kind of psychological contract need to be discussed clearly rather than implicitly. So you have to discuss everything in explicit way. So there should not be any chances of confusion between interviewer and the interviewee. That's why interview can be used as information giving, or can be used to explore the further employment opportunities of an interviewee with the company via interviewer. If the candidate is made an offer, the decision as whether to accept depends to an extent on the impression he or she forms of the interview. So how would candidate make a decision? He would make a decision keeping in view the impression given by the interviewer. What kind of impression interviewer would give? That impression would ask or would compel the interviewee to take a decision whether he need to accept an offer or he doesn't need to accept an offer. So interviewing can be used, competency-based interviewing can be used for a different purpose, sometimes just for the initial screening, sometimes for the in-depth assessment, and sometimes for just to get information about the candidate and about the company.